Hey there, home labbers and engineers. FE Engineer here. So the other day, we set up Stable Diffusion running on our AMD GPUs. And the video started to get a little bit long, but I wanted to also include tips and tricks for using Stable Diffusion with AMD GPUs, as well as just some general help for things that you may run into and problems that you may come across. So with that, let's get into using Stable Diffusion and going through what we can do with our AMD GPUs. I do want to go over a handful of things that you may run into running automatic1111 with AMD. Depending on the settings that you set for different things, you may run across an error that comes through your command prompt saying kernel not found. If you run into that error, specifically all you need to do is hit Control C, which will bring up this terminate batch job, tell it yes, then hit up twice, and then reload, and that should fix the error. If you happen to run into an error where it says something about olive cache cannot be found, one time when I was loading a new model, I ended up with this error saying that olive cache could not be found. If you run into that error, here we are in our Stable Diffusion webui DirectML. If we look inside of models, there is a folder called olive cache. If at any point you run into something when you're trying to optimize a model or load a new model, and it says that this olive cache folder cannot be found, the way to fix it is to effectively just create a new folder, call it olive cache with a capital O and a capital C, and then just hit enter so that you will then have a folder called olive cache. And that's really all it's looking for, is just a folder with that exact name. It doesn't have to have anything in it. So if you run into that error, just create a new folder, call it olive cache, and that should fix it for you. Those are the most common errors I have run into when running automatic1111 on AMD. However, another thing that you can do is inside of this folder, you will notice this venv. This stands for virtual environment, and this is where Anaconda installs all of the virtual environment settings and things for this specific project. So what you can do if things get really screwed up and you are simply restarting it won't work, your olive cache folder is in there, but it's still just not running and you don't really understand what's going on, you can literally just hit the delete button, delete out this virtual environment folder, and then once you delete out that virtual environment folder, to get Anaconda to rebuild it, what you do is instead of webui.bat, you use webui-user.bat. And then -ONNX backend DirectML, just like normal. But the key is this webui-user. This will have Anaconda rebuild this virtual environment entirely. Now, with all that being said, if things are up and running the way you want, only use the webui.bat file. Don't use webui-user. Because webui-user will also potentially pull in new GitHub updates for some of the repositories. You will notice inside of here we have repositories, and inside of these repositories there are in fact more things. Every time you use that webui-user, it will try to pull all of these all over again. And so when you use webui-user, if you have not used this for like a few months, If you use webui.bat, nothing should change. And so if it worked before, it should continue working. If you use webui-user, you may run into a scenario where some of these repositories have updated and something effectively new is broken. And so generally speaking, you only want to use webui-user if you are planning on rebuilding your entire virtual environment. Other than that, I would not use webui-user on a regular basis, especially not to just start it up. Those are most of the problems that I have seen come through somewhat regularly, and that should help you, if you do run into those, to be able to get around it and get Stable Diffusion back up and running. Some other command line arguments that folks may end up needing, and I will have both some of the standard ones in the video description below, as well as a link that goes out to show you all of the command line arguments, but ones that some people may be particularly interested in is --lowram. This is for exactly what you think. It's for a GPU that has a low amount of VRAM, generally speaking, probably 4 gigs or maybe even less. I don't think you could get it to run on a 2 gig card, and on a 4 gig card, it's going to be difficult. So you will probably need to set something like low RAM. There's also a medium RAM, which does sacrifice a little bit of performance, but it should help if you are running out of RAM on your video card. Setting something like this will help, as well as there are tons of different ones that you can essentially set for like split attention and sub-quad attention. And these are ways to utilize your memory a little bit more efficiently. Generally, they do come with a bit of a performance trade-off. So for folks who want to be maximum lazy and don't feel like typing in these command line arguments every time, you can just do it this way. And the reason why I like using webui.bat instead of webui-user is that webui.bat, if it works today, effectively, I should never need to change anything, and it should work tomorrow, next week, next month, because it's not trying to update any of the GitHub repositories, whereas webui-user does tend to try to update GitHub repositories. I'm going to try to keep this video very straightforward and very straight to the point because we have quite a bit to go over. In order to run your Stable Diffusion with Anaconda, similar to what we did when we set it up, you can type in conda info --envs. This gives you a listing of your different conda environments that you can enable. In order to enable an environment, conda activate and then the environment name. So SD_olive. You can tell that we're now in our activated environment because we're at SD_olive instead of base. The command, just like when we set it up, to run Stable Diffusion is webui.bat --ONNX --backend DirectML. Once this has finished loading, you will see running on local URL 127.0.0.1.78.60, and then you should be able to go to your Stable Diffusion. Generating images in Stable Diffusion is done by using prompts, and Stable Diffusion uses a prompt and a negative prompt. Think of the prompt as the things you want to see in the image, and the negative prompt as things that you specifically want to not see in the image. Let's go through a very simple example of this. For a prompt, you could have a girl, and for the negative prompt, well, let's just generate this prompt, a girl. You can tell this is exceedingly non-specific, and we'll just say that while she looks a little bit odd here, We'll say she's wearing a white shirt, and we'll say that we don't want to see that. White shirt. Well, she is no longer wearing a white shirt. So you can see that the negative prompt can be used as a way to control effectively variables. When building prompts, there are two ways of doing it. If you search the internet and look for best prompts, you may see things that come out looking like this. A girl wearing a black shirt with a red hat who has green hair running in a field of wildflowers. And on the internet, many times they will not give you a negative prompt at all. And if we hit generate, this may produce an okay result, but honestly, I mean, that's kind of okay, I guess. It's somewhat reasonable. I find that these long sentence-like prompts are not necessarily the best. I like to separate the things I do want and then negative prompt a whole lot of things that I don't want. But what I do is I keep it in very, very small digestible pieces for the AI. And what I mean by that is a girl with green hair, comma, red hat, comma, field of wildflowers, and then if we just hit generate from that, we will probably get something very similar again to this. Actually, that kind of looks better overall. The eye is a little odd, but other than that, and I don't know what this is. But I find that the AI does significantly better when you tell it very small blurbs of things that you want, and you effectively let the AI put it together. You'll see here, I put red hat in. It put the hat on the person. It doesn't have a hat just floating off in the air. So there's a lot of times where you don't need to be so overly descriptive to say a girl wearing a red hat. You can put that in if you're going to leave it as just that, but I already had a girl with green hair, and saying wearing a red hat is just making it very complicated for the AI. And instead I can just say a girl with green hair, because I want a girl with green hair. And then I can just say red hat. Other things that will significantly improve your experience are things that you don't even think about. Stuff like professional photography, professional lighting, professional color grading, 8K ultra realistic, photorealistic, dynamic lighting, ray tracing, HDR. And then what we want to use the negative prompts for is separating out things that we really, really, really do not want. And stuff that we do not want is stuff like low resolution, medium resolution, ugly, malformed, deformed. Oh, another common one that you can put in the top is masterpiece. Extra limbs, extra digits, 3 hands, 3 legs, gross, text, artist name. These are very common things to potentially put in that helps to just weed out kind of bad examples. Whoa. I find that sometimes faces get really strange. Let's just regenerate. So you'll see we've regenerated quite a few times and we keep having kind of messed up faces. The sampling method seems to affect this quite a lot. And so by changing over to Euler Ancestral, pretty much right off the bat, I got a great result. This is a really good picture overall. You'll see the face is unbelievably better. Even Euler seems to work very well. Generally, the ones that I use all the time are going to be Euler or Euler Ancestral. I mean, these images are really good. And compared to the one that I was just doing, you can tell that, I mean, I ran it 3 separate times and got really odd faces. Changing my sampling method over here significantly improved things. Next up, after messing around with using prompts to generate the image that you want, sampling steps. Effectively, this is how many times it will go over and take a look at it and potentially make refinements. If you're using a card that's fast enough, you really want to bump this up if you can. You will just tend to get better images out of more sampling steps. Although you can tell that even at only 20 sampling steps, it's possible to get really good results. But let's bump this up to 150 all the way up and see if this does better. I think there's a bit more detail in this one, and you can see that the photography part, you know, the landscape is somewhat defocused and the foreground is more focused. So keeping your sampling steps up, it takes longer to generate every image, but if you have a fast enough card, you should definitely consider bumping up the sampling steps. Moving on to the next piece. With AMD cards, I have noticed this high-res fix simply does not work. You can try it out if you want. You can add high-res steps if you want. I have just not been able to ever get it to work appropriately. It just does not seem to work. The refiner. The refiner is only for using Stable Diffusion XL models, and those models include both a base and a refiner. I have gotten them installed. I have gotten them to technically run. I have never been able to get this refiner to actually work appropriately. And because of that, when you run Stable Diffusion XL, it doesn't matter what you're running. If you're running the base model, the refiner then effectively, if it doesn't trigger the refiner, you will not get good results. So while I have gotten Stable Diffusion XL loaded in and running, I've never been able to get the refiner to work, so I've never gotten good results because the refiner is required. Moving on to the next piece, width and height. This does exactly what you think. It will change the width and the height of the output image. I would not generally recommend changing it from 512. And the reason why is because when you are putting in prompts and you are testing things out and you are trying to get an image that you like, generating at 512 is where you're going to see really good performance. If you generate, say, double the size at 1024 by 1024, it will take roughly 4 times longer to generate an image. And if you are trying to get an image that you like, generate them at 512, or you could potentially even go smaller, to generate them quickly. Once you get an image that you like, even at a smaller scale, then you can upscale it by a multiplier. So effectively from 512, we could multiply by 2 and get 1024 by 1024. And that is why I do not recommend changing the width and height here. However, if you want to get a different aspect ratio instead of a square, we could do 1024 by 512. And now we will get a more landscape looking shot. Although you will notice, because we now have a lot more pixels that we're generating, my iterations per second has significantly dropped. But we now have a different aspect ratio image. the batch count. I'm going to drop this back down to 512. What the batch count does is it effectively tells Stable Diffusion, use all of these settings, and because I am maybe looking for interesting ideas or things like that, just automatically create X number of images. And so what it will do is it will run one entire image, it will stop, and then it will run a second time, and then a third time, and it will run the number of times of the batch count. Graphics cards that don't have as much VRAM will significantly benefit from it stopping and starting because it effectively allows it to offload stuff out of memory. And once it generates the images, you will see that it gives them to us in a nice little grid, and you'll see that all three of these images looked fairly good. If you drop the batch count down to 1 and take the batch size and move it up to 3, when we hit run, now you will see my iterations per second are no longer 20, now it's 10. But I did get 3 images again. So effectively it ran 3, but it ran them all at the same time. Again, for cards that are lower in VRAM, you may not be able to change the batch size at all. It may effectively run out of memory and stop working. So if you're on a higher memory card, you can probably use batch size if you want. You will get slightly better performance because you're able to effectively run all of the images in one pass, even though it's doing multiple images, versus batch count, which has to do one, then stop, then start, then do one, then stop, then start. But so it's going to depend on the amount of VRAM that you really have as to whether you can use batch size and whether you should use batch size. CFG Scale basically tells the AI how closely of attention to pay to exactly what your prompt is. A CFG scale of 1 gives it a large amount of creative freedom, and a CFG scale all the way at 30 effectively tells it to have little to no creative freedom and to just basically do exactly what is in here. And the default is 7. I find that typically works very nicely. It's a nice mix between creative expression, but still following your prompt. But what we want to do is we want to upscale this image. So let's click on this little button right here. This is the in-painting button. So go ahead and click on that. And so you'll see that it moved this girl into here, and there's another one over here. What we can do is use just resize, change the sampling method to not be terrible, change the sampling steps. We want to do 150 because we really like this one. Resize by 2. This should resize it from 512 to 1024. And you shouldn't need to change your prompt. If you do want to change your prompt, you can. And by changing your prompt in here, it will effectively tell it when it's using this as inspiration to maybe change a bit or a piece of it. You'll notice since we're generating a much larger image, the iterations per second have dropped substantially. And so now we have another great image, only now it's 1024 instead of 512. As this is mostly a beginner's guide, I am not going to go over all of the finer details of training and hyper networks and LoRa and things like that. There is a settings tab. Inside of the settings tab, there is all sorts of options to choose from and things to effectively play around with until you get things that you like. Generally speaking, for most people, you shouldn't necessarily need to make very many changes to the settings, but just know that there is a lot in here. Thank you so much for watching my videos, home labbers and engineers. I create and edit all of these videos on my own, so any likes and subscribes will massively help out the channel and allow me to continue creating content to help people. If you got value out of this, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel to be notified when new content drops. If there's something I've not covered but you would like to see a video on it, please leave a comment down below. And again, a massive thank you to everyone. I hope you have a great day.